Chapter 10 of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland.
The Prison Isle of Shador. In the outer gardens, to which the guard now escorted me, I found Zodar, surrounded by a crowd of noble blacks. They were reviling and cursing him. The men slapped his face. The women spat upon him. When I appeared, they turned their attentions toward me. "Ah," cried one, "so this is the creature who overcame the great Zodar barehanded. Let us see how it was done." "Let him bind Thurid," suggested a beautiful woman, laughing. "Thurid is a noble dator. Let Thurid show the dog what it means to face a real man." "Yes, Thurid, Thurid!" cried a dozen voices. "Here he is now!" exclaimed another, and turning in the direction indicated, I saw a huge black, weighed down with resplendent ornaments and arms, advancing with noble and gallant bearing toward us. "What now?" he cried. "What would you of Thurid?" Quickly a dozen voices explained. Thurid turned toward Zodar, his eyes narrowing to two nasty slits. "Callet," he hissed, "ever did I think you carried the heart of a Sorak in your putrid breast. Often have you bested me in the secret councils of Isis, but now, in the field of war, where men are truly gauged, your scabby heart hath revealed its sores to all the world. Callet, I spurn you with my foot." And with the words he turned to kick Zodar. My blood was up. For minutes it had been boiling at the cowardly treatment they had been according this once powerful comrade, because he had fallen from the favor of Isis. I had no love for Zodar, but I cannot stand the sight of cowardly injustice and persecution without seeing red as through a haze of bloody mist, and doing things on the impulse of the moment that I presume I never should do after mature deliberation. I was standing close beside Zodar as Thurid swung his foot for the cowardly kick. The degraded dator stood erect and motionless as a carven image. He was prepared to take whatever his former comrades had to offer in the way of insults and reproaches, and take them in manly silence and stoicism. But as Thurid's foot swung, so did mine, and I caught him a painful blow upon the shin bone that saved Zodar from this added ignominy. For a moment there was tense silence. Then Thurid, with a roar of rage, sprang for my throat, just as Zodar had upon the deck of the cruiser. The results were identical. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me, planted a terrific right upon the side of his jaw. The big fellow spun around like a top. His knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. The blacks gazed in astonishment, first at the still form of the proud dator lying there in the ruby dust of the pathway, then at me, as though they could not believe that such a thing could be. "You asked me to bind Thurid," I cried. "Behold." And then I stooped beside the prostrate form, tore the harness from it, and bound the fellow's arms and legs securely. "As you have done to Zodar, now do you likewise to Thurid. Take him before Isis, bound in his own harness, that she may see with her own eyes that there be one among you now who is greater than the firstborn." "Who are you?" whispered the woman who had first suggested that I attempt to bind Thurid. "I am a citizen of two worlds, Captain John Carter of Virginia, Prince of the House of Tartas Moors, Jeddak of Helium. Take this man to your goddess, as I have said, and tell her, too, that as I have done to Zodar and Thurid, so also can I do to the mightiest of her dators. With naked hands, with long sword or with short sword, I challenge the flower of her fighting men to combat." "Come," said the officer who was guarding me back to Shador. "My orders are imperative. There is to be no delay. Zodar, come you also." There was little of disrespect in the tone that the man used in addressing either Zodar or myself. It was evident that he felt less contempt for the former dator since he had witnessed the ease with which I disposed of the powerful Thurid. That his respect for me was greater than it should have been for a slave was quite apparent from the fact that, during the balance of the return journey, he walked or stood always behind me, a drawn short sword in his hand. The return to the Sea of Omin was uneventful. We dropped down the awful shaft in the same car that had brought us to the surface. There we entered the submarine, taking the long dive to the tunnel far beneath the upper world. Then, through the tunnel and up again to the pool from which we had our first introduction to the wonderful passageway from Omin to the Temple of Isis. From the island of our submarine, we were transported on a small cruiser to the distant isle of Shador. Here we found a small stone prison and a guard of half a dozen blacks. There was no ceremony wasted in completing our incarceration. One of the blacks opened the door of the prison with a huge key. We walked in, the door closed behind us, the lock grated, and with the sound there swept over me again that terrible feeling of hopelessness that I had felt in the chamber of mystery in the golden cliffs beneath the gardens of the holy ferns. Then Tarkas had been with me, but now I was utterly alone insofar as friendly companionship was concerned. I fell to wondering about the fate of the great Thark, and of his beautiful companion, the girl Thuvia. Even should they by some miracle have escaped and been received and spared by a friendly nation, what hope had I of the succor which I knew they would gladly extend if it lay in their power? They could not guess my whereabouts or my fate, for none on all Barsoom even dream of such a place as this. Nor would it have advantaged me any had they known the exact location of my prison, for who could hope to penetrate to this buried sea in the face of the mighty navy of the firstborn? No, my case was hopeless. Well, I would make the best of it, and rising, I swept aside the brooding despair that had been endeavoring to claim me. With the idea of exploring my prison, I started to look around. Zodar sat with bowed head upon a low stone bench near the center of the room in which we were. He had not spoken since Isis had degraded him. The building was roofless, the walls rising to a height of about 30 feet. Halfway up were a couple of small, heavily barred windows. The prison was divided into several rooms by partitions 20 feet high. There was no one in the room which we occupied, but 2 doors, which led to other rooms, were open. I entered one of these rooms, but found it vacant. Thus I continued through several of the chambers, until in the last one I found a young red Martian boy sleeping upon the stone bench which constituted the only furniture of any of the prison cells. Evidently he was the only other prisoner. As he slept, I leaned over and looked at him. There was something strangely familiar about his face, and yet I could not place him. His features were very regular, and, like the proportions of his graceful limbs and body, beautiful in the extreme. He was very light in color for a red man, but in other respects he seemed a typical specimen of this handsome race. I did not awaken him, for sleep in prison is such a priceless boon that I have seen men transformed into raging brutes when robbed by one of their fellow prisoners of a few precious moments of it. Returning to my own cell, I found Zodar still sitting in the same position in which I had left him. "Man," I cried, "it will profit you nothing to mope thus. It were no disgrace to be bested by John Carter. You have seen that in the ease with which I accounted for Thurid. You knew it before, when on the cruiser's back you saw me slay 3 of your comrades." "I would that you had dispatched me at the same time," he said. "Come, come," I cried, "there is hope yet. Neither of us is dead. We are great fighters. Why not win to freedom?" He looked at me in amazement. "You know not of what you speak," he replied. "Isis is omnipotent. Isis is omniscient. She hears now the words you speak. She knows the thoughts you think. It is sacrilege even to dream of breaking her commands." "Rot, Zodar!" I ejaculated impatiently. He sprang to his feet in horror. "The curse of Isis will fall upon you," he cried. "In another instant you will be smitten down, writhing to your death in horrible agony." "Do you believe that, Zodar?" I asked. "Of course. Who would dare doubt?" "I doubt? Yes, and further, I deny," I said. "Why, Zodar, you tell me that she even knows my thoughts. The red men have all had that power for ages. And another wonderful power. They can shut their minds so that none may read their thoughts. I learned the first secret years ago. The other I never had to learn, since upon all Barsoom is none who can read what passes in the secret chambers of my brain. Your goddess cannot read my thoughts, nor can she read yours when you are out of sight, unless you will it. Had she been able to read mine, I am afraid that her pride would have suffered a rather severe shock when I turned at her command to gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face." "What do you mean?" he whispered in an affrighted voice, so low that I could scarcely hear him. "I mean that I thought her the most repulsive and vilely hideous creature my eyes ever had rested upon." For a moment he eyed me in horror-stricken amazement, and then, with a cry of "Blasphemer!" he sprang upon me. I did not wish to strike him again, nor was it necessary, since he was unarmed, and therefore quite harmless to me. As he came, I grasped his left wrist with my left hand, and, swinging my right arm above his left shoulder, caught him beneath the chin with my elbow, and bore him backward across my thigh. There he hung, helpless for a moment, glaring up at me in impotent rage. "Zodar," I said, "let us be friends. For a year, possibly, we may be forced to live together in the narrow confines of this tiny room. I am sorry to have offended you, but I could not dream that one who had suffered from the cruel injustice of Isis still could believe her divine. I will say a few more words, Zodar, with no intent to wound your feelings further, but rather that you may give thought to the fact that, while we live, we are still more the arbiters of our own fate than is any god. Isis, you see, has not struck me dead, nor is she rescuing her faithful Zodar from the clutches of the unbeliever who defamed her fair beauty. No, Zodar, your Isis is a mortal old woman. Once out of her clutches, and she cannot harm you. With your knowledge of this strange land, and my knowledge of the outer world, two such fighting men as you and I should be able to win our way to freedom. Even though we died in the attempt, would not our memories be fairer than as though we remained in servile fear to be butchered by a cruel and unjust tyrant? Call her goddess or mortal, as you will." As I finished, I raised Zodar to his feet and released him. He did not renew the attack upon me, nor did he speak. Instead, he walked toward the bench, and, sinking down upon it, remained lost in deep thought for hours. A long time afterward, I heard a soft sound at the doorway leading to one of the other apartments, and, looking up, beheld the red Martian youth gazing intently at us. "Kaor," I cried, after the red Martian manner of greeting. "Kaor," he replied, "what do you here?" "I await my death, I presume," I replied with a wry smile. He too smiled, a brave and winning smile. "I also," he said. "Mine will come soon. I looked upon the radiant beauty of Isis nearly a year since. It has always been a source of keen wonder to me that I did not drop dead at the first sight of that hideous countenance. And her belly! By my first ancestor, but never was there so grotesque a figure in all the universe. That they should call such a one goddess of life eternal, goddess of death, mother of the nearer moon, and 50 other equally impossible titles, is quite beyond me." "How came you here?" I asked. "It is very simple. I was flying a one-man air scout far to the south when the brilliant idea occurred to me that I should like to search for the lost Sea of Chorus, which tradition places near to the South Pole. I must have inherited from my father a wild lust for adventure, as well as a hollow where my bump of reverence should be. I had reached the area of eternal ice when my port propeller jammed, and I dropped to the ground to make repairs. Before I knew it, the air was black with flyers, and 100 of these first-born devils were leaping to the ground all about me. With drawn swords they made for me, but before I went down beneath them, they had tasted of the steel of my father's sword, and I had given such an account of myself as I know would have pleased my sire had he lived to witness it. "Your father is dead?" I asked. "He died before the shell broke, to let me step out into a world that has been very good to me. But for the sorrow that I had never the honor to know my father, I have been very happy. My only sorrow now is that my mother must mourn me as she has for 10 long years mourned my father." "Who was your father?" I asked. He was about to reply when the outer door of our prison opened, and a burly guard entered and ordered him to his own quarters for the night, locking the door after him as he passed through into the further chamber. "It is Issa's wish that you two be confined in the same room," said the guard, when he had returned to our cell. "This cowardly slave of a slave is to serve you well," he said to me, indicating Zodar with a wave of his hand. "If he does not, you are to beat him into submission. It is Issa's wish that you heap upon him every indignity and degradation of which you can conceive." With these words he left us. Zodar still sat with his face buried in his hands. I walked to his side and placed my hand upon his shoulder. "Zodar," I said, "you have heard the commands of Isis, but you need not fear that I shall attempt to put them into execution. You are a brave man, Zodar. It is your own affair if you wish to be persecuted and humiliated, but were I you, I should assert my manhood and defy my enemies." "I have been thinking very hard, John Carter," he said, "of all the new ideas you gave me a few hours since. Little by little I have been piecing together the things that you said which sounded blasphemous to me then, with the things that I have seen in my past life, and dared not even think about for fear of bringing down upon me the wrath of Isis. I believe now that she is a fraud, no more divine than you or I. More, I am willing to concede, that the firstborn are no holier than the holy Therns, nor the holy Therns more holy than the red men. The whole fabric of our religion is based on superstitious belief in lies that have been foisted upon us for ages by those directly above us, to whose personal profit and aggrandizement it was to have us continue to believe as they wished us to believe. I am ready to cast off the ties that have bound me. I am ready to defy Isis herself. But what will it avail us? Be the firstborn gods or mortals, they are a powerful race, and we are as fast in their clutches as though we were already dead. There is no escape." "I have escaped from bad plights in the past, my friend," I replied. "Nor while life is in me shall I despair of escaping from the Isle of Shador and the Sea of Omine." "But we cannot even escape from the 4 walls of our prison," urged Zodar. "Test this flint-like surface," he cried, smiting the solid rock that confined us, "and look upon this polished surface. None could cling to it to reach the top." I smiled. "That is the least of our troubles, Zodar," I replied. "I will guarantee to scale the wall and take you with me, if you will help with your knowledge of the customs here to appoint the best time for the attempt, and guide me to the shaft that lets from the dome of this abysmal sea to the light of God's pure air above. Nighttime is the best, and offers the only slender chance we have, for then men sleep, and only a dozing watch nods in the tops of the battleships. No watch is kept upon the cruisers and smaller craft. The watchers upon the larger vessels see to all about them. It is night now. But, I exclaimed, it is not dark. How can it be night, then? He smiled. You forget, he said, that we are far below ground. The light of the sun never penetrates here. There are no moons, and no stars reflected in the bosom of Omine. The phosphorescent light you now see pervading this great subterranean vault emanates from the rocks that form its dome. It is always thus upon Omine, just as the billows are always as you see them, rolling, ever rolling over a windless sea. At the appointed hour of night upon the world above, the men whose duties hold them here sleep, but the light is ever the same. It will make escape more difficult, I said, and then I shrugged my shoulders. For what, pray, is the pleasure of doing an easy thing? Let us sleep on it tonight, said Zodar. A plan may come with our awakening. So we threw ourselves upon the hard stone floor of our prison and slept the sleep of tired men.
End of chapter 10. Recording by Thomas Copeland. By Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland.
When hell broke loose. Early the next morning, Zodar and I commenced work upon our plans for escape. First, I had him sketch upon the stone floor of our cell as accurate a map of the south polar regions as was possible with the crude instruments at our disposal, a buckle for my harness, and the sharp edge of the wondrous gem I had taken from Sator Throg. From this I computed the general direction of helium and the distance at which it lay from the opening which led to Omine. Then I had him draw a map of Omine, indicating plainly the position of Shador and of the opening in the dome which led to the outer world. These I studied until they were indelibly imprinted in my memory. From Zodar I learned the duties and customs of the guards who patrolled Shador. It seemed that during the hours set aside for sleep, only one man was on duty at a time. He paced a beat that passed around the prison at a distance of about 100 feet from the building. The pace of the sentry, Zodar said, was very slow, requiring nearly 10 minutes to make a single round. This meant that for practically 5 minutes at a time, each side of the prison was unguarded as the sentry pursued his snail-like pace upon the opposite side. This information you asked, said Zodar, will all be very valuable after we get out, but nothing that you have asked me has any bearing on that first and most important consideration. We will get out, all right, I replied, laughing. Leave that to me. When shall we make the attempt? He asked. The first night that finds a small craft moored near the shore of Shador, I replied. But how will you know that any craft is moored near Shador? The windows are far beyond our reach. Not so, friend Zodar. Look. With a bound, I sprang to the bars of the window opposite us and took a quick survey of the scene without. Several small craft and 2 large battleships lay within 100 yards of Shador. Tonight, I thought, and was just about to voice my decision to Zodar, when, without warning, the door of our prison opened, and a guard stepped in. If the fellow saw me there, our chances of escape might quickly go glimmering, for I knew that they would put me in irons if they had the slightest conception of the wonderful agility which my earthly muscles gave me upon Mars. The man had entered and was standing facing the center of the room, so that his back was toward me. 5 feet above me was the top of a partition wall separating our cell from the next. There was my only chance to escape detection. If the fellow turned, I was lost, nor could I have dropped to the floor undetected, since he was so nearly below me that I would have struck him had I done so. "Where is the white man?" cried the guard of Zodar. "Isis commands his presence." He started to turn to see if I were in another part of the cell. I scrambled up the iron grating of the window until I could catch a good footing on the sill with 1 foot. Then I let go my hold and sprang for the partition top. What was that? I heard the deep voice of the black bellow as my metal grated against the stone wall as I slipped over. Then I dropped lightly to the floor of the cell beyond. "Where is the white slave?" again cried the guard. "I know not," replied Zodar. "He was here even as you entered. I am not his keeper. Go find him." The black grumbled something that I could not understand, and then I heard him unlocking the door into one of the other cells on the further side. Listening intently, I caught the sound as the door closed behind him. Then I sprang once more to the top of the partition and dropped into my own cell beside the astonished Zodar. "Do you see how we will escape?" I asked him in a whisper. "I see how you may," he replied, "but I am no wiser than before as to how I am to pass these walls. Certain it is that I cannot bounce over them as you do." We heard the guard moving about from cell to cell, and finally, his rounds completed, he again entered ours. When his eyes fell upon me, they fairly bulged from his head. "By the shell of my first ancestor," he roared, "where have you been?" "I have been in prison since you put me here yesterday," I answered. "I was in this room when you entered. You had better look to your eyesight." He glared at me in mingled rage and relief. "Come," he said, "Isis commands your presence." He conducted me outside the prison, leaving Zodar behind. There we found several other guards, and with them the red Martian youth, who occupied another cell upon Shador. The journey I had taken to the temple of Isis on the preceding day was repeated. The guards kept the red boy and myself separated, so that we had no opportunity to continue the conversation that had been interrupted the previous night. The youth's face had haunted me. Where had I seen him before? There was something strangely familiar in every line of him, in his carriage, his manner of speaking, his gestures. I could have sworn that I knew him, and yet I knew, too, that I had never seen him before. When we reached the gardens of Isis, we were led away from the temple instead of toward it. The way wound through enchanted parks to a mighty wall that towered 100 feet in air. Massive gates gave egress upon a small plain surrounded by the same gorgeous forests that I had seen at the foot of the Golden Cliffs. Crowds of blacks were strolling in the same direction that our guards were leading us, and with them mingled my old friends, the plant men and great white apes. The brutal beasts moved among the crowd as pet dogs might. If they were in the way, the blacks pushed them roughly to one side or whacked them with the flat of a sword, and the animals slunk away as in great fear. Presently we came upon our destination, a great amphitheater, situated at the further edge of the plain, and about 1/2 mile beyond the garden walls. Through a massive arched gateway, the blacks poured in to take their seats, while our guards led us to a smaller entrance near one end of the structure. Through this we passed into an enclosure beneath the seats, where we found a number of other prisoners herded together under guard. Some of them were in irons, but for the most part they seemed sufficiently awed by the presence of their guards to preclude any possibility of attempted escape. During the trip from Shador, I had had no opportunity to talk with my fellow prisoner, but now that we were safely within the barred paddock, our guards abated their watchfulness, with the result that I found myself able to approach the red Martian youth, for whom I felt such a strange attraction. "What is the object of this assembly?" I asked him. "Are we to fight for the edification of the firstborn, or is it something worse than that?" "It is a part of the monthly rites of Isis," he replied, "in which black men wash the sins from their souls in the blood of men from the outer world. If perchance the black is killed, it is evidence of his disloyalty to Isis, the unpardonable sin. If he lives through the contest, he is held acquitted of the charge that forced the sentence of the rites, as it is called, upon him. The forms of combat vary. A number of us may be pitted together against an equal number, or twice the number of blacks. Or singly we may be sent forth to face wild beasts or some famous black warrior." "And if we are victorious," I asked, "what then? Freedom?" He laughed. "Freedom, forsooth. The only freedom for us is death. None who enters the domains of the firstborn ever leave." If we prove able fighters, we are permitted to fight often. If we are not mighty fighters, he shrugged his shoulders, sooner or later we die in the arena. And you have fought often? I asked. Very often, he replied. It is my only pleasure. Some 100 black devils have I accounted for during nearly a year of the rites of Isis. My mother would be very proud, could she only know how well I have maintained the traditions of my father's prowess. Your father must have been a mighty warrior, I said. I have known most of the warriors of Barsoom in my time. Doubtless I knew him. Who was he? My father was— Come, Callets, cried the rough voice of a guard. To the slaughter with you. And roughly we were hustled to the steep incline that led to the chambers far below, which let out upon the arena. The amphitheatre, like all I had ever seen upon Barsoom, was built in a large excavation. Only the highest seats, which formed the low wall surrounding the pit, were above the level of the ground. The arena itself was far below the surface. Just beneath the lowest tier of seats was a series of barred cages on a level with the surface of the arena. Into these we were herded, but unfortunately my youthful friend was not of those who occupied a cage with me. Directly opposite my cage was the throne of Isis. Here the horrid creature squatted, surrounded by 100 slave maidens sparkling in jeweled trappings. Brilliant cloths of many hues and strange patterns formed the soft cushioned covering of the dais upon which they reclined about her. On 4 sides of the throne, and several feet below it, stood 3 solid ranks of heavily armed soldiery, elbow to elbow. In front of these were the high dignitaries of this mock heaven, gleaming blacks bedecked with precious stones, upon their foreheads the insignia of their rank set in circles of gold. On both sides of the throne stretched a solid mass of humanity from top to bottom of the amphitheatre. There were as many women as men, and each was clothed in the wondrously wrought harness of his station and his house. With each black was from 1 to 3 slaves, drawn from the domains of the Therns and from the outer world. The blacks are all noble. There is no peasantry among the firstborn. Even the lowest soldier is a god, and has his slaves to wait upon him. The firstborn do no work. The men fight, that is a sacred privilege and duty, to fight and die for Isis. The women do nothing, absolutely nothing. Slaves wash them, slaves dress them, slaves feed them. There are some even who have slaves that talk for them, and I saw one who sat during the rites with closed eyes while a slave narrated to her the events that were transpiring within the arena. The first event of the day was the tribute to Isis. It marked the end of those poor unfortunates who had looked upon the divine glory of the goddess a full year before. There were 10 of them, splendid beauties from the proud courts of mighty Jedaks and from the temples of the holy Therns. For a year they had served in the retinue of Isis. Today they were to pay the price of this divine preferment with their lives. Tomorrow they would grace the tables of the court functionaries. A huge black entered the arena with the young women. Carefully he inspected them, felt of their limbs, and poked them in the ribs. Presently he selected one of their number, whom he led before the throne of Isis. He addressed some words to the goddess which I could not hear. Isis nodded her head. The black raised his hands above his head in token of salute, grasped the girl by the wrist, and dragged her from the arena through a small doorway below the throne. "Isis will dine well tonight," said a prisoner beside me. "What do you mean?" I asked. "That was her dinner that old Thebus is taking to the kitchens. Didst not note how carefully he selected the plumpest and tenderest of the lot?" I growled out my curses on the monster sitting opposite us on the gorgeous throne. "Fume not," admonished my companion. "You will see far worse than that if you live even a month among the firstborn." I turned again in time to see the gate of a nearby cage thrown open, and 3 monstrous white apes spring into the arena. The girls shrank in a frightened group in the center of the enclosure. One was on her knees, with imploring hands outstretched toward Isis. But the hideous deity only leaned further forward in keener anticipation of the entertainment to come. At length the apes spied the huddled knot of terror-stricken maidens, and with demoniacal shrieks of bestial frenzy charged upon them. A wave of mad fury surged over me. The cruel cowardliness of the power-drunk creature whose malignant mind conceived such frightful forms of torture stirred to their uttermost depths my resentment and my manhood. The blood-red haze that presaged death to my foes swam before my eyes. The guard lolled before the unbarred gate of the cage which confined me. What need of bars, indeed, to keep these poor victims from rushing into the arena which the edict of the gods had appointed as their death place? A single blow sent the black unconscious to the ground. Snatching up his long sword, I sprang into the arena. The apes were almost upon the maidens, but a couple of mighty bounds were all my earthly muscles required to carry me to the center of the sand-strewn floor. For an instant, silence reigned in the great amphitheater. Then a wild shout arose from the cages of the doomed. My longsword circled whirring through the air, and a great ape sprawled headless at the feet of the fainting girls. The other apes turned now upon me, and, as I stood facing them, a sullen roar from the audience answered the wild cheers from the cages. From the tail of my eye, I saw a score of guards rushing across the glistening sand toward me. Then a figure broke from one of the cages behind them. It was the youth whose personality so fascinated me. He paused a moment before the cages, with upraised sword.
"Come, men of the outer world," he shouted. "Let us make our deaths worthwhile, and at the back of this unknown warrior turn this day's tribute to Isis into an orgy of revenge that will echo through the ages and cause black skins to blanch at each repetition of the rites of Isis. Come! The racks without your cages are filled with blades."
Without waiting to note the outcome of his plea, he turned and bounded toward me. From every cage that harbored red men, a thunderous shout went up in answer to his exhortation. The inner guards went down beneath howling mobs, and the cages vomited forth their inmates, hot with the lust to kill. The racks that stood without were stripped of the swords with which the prisoners were to have been armed to enter their allotted combats, and a swarm of determined warriors sped to our support. The great apes, towering in all their 15 feet of height, had gone down before my sword, while the charging guards were still some distance away. Close behind them pursued the youth. At my back were the young girls, and, as it was in their service that I fought, I remained standing there to meet my inevitable death, but with the determination to give such an account of myself as would long be remembered in the land of the firstborn. I noted the marvelous speed of the young red man as he raced after the guards. Never had I seen such speed in any Martian. His leaps and bounds were little short of those which my earthly muscles had produced to create such awe and respect on the part of the green Martians into whose hands I had fallen on that long-gone day that had seen my first advent upon Mars. The guards had not reached me when he fell upon them from the rear, and as they turned, thinking from the fierceness of his onslaught that a dozen were attacking them, I rushed them from my side. In the rapid fighting that followed, I had little chance to note aught else than the movements of my immediate adversaries, but now and again I caught the fleeting glimpse of a purring sword and a lightly springing figure of sinewy steel that filled my heart with a strange yearning and a mighty but unaccountable pride. On the handsome face of the boy a grim smile played, and ever and anon he threw a taunting challenge to the foes that faced him. In this and other ways, his manner of fighting was similar to that which had always marked me on the field of combat. Perhaps it was this vague likeness which made me love the boy, while the awful havoc that his sword played amongst the blacks filled my soul with tremendous respect for him. For my part, I was fighting as I had fought 1,000 times before, now sidestepping a wicked thrust, now stepping quickly in to let my sword's point drink deep in a foeman's heart, before it buried itself in the throat of his companion. We were having a merry time of it, we two, when a great body of Isis' own guards were ordered into the arena. On they came with fierce cries, while from every side the armed prisoners swarmed upon them. For half an hour it was as though all hell had broken loose. In the walled confines of the arena we fought in an inextricable mass, howling, cursing, blood-streaked demons, and ever the sword of the young red man flashed beside me. Slowly, and by repeated commands, I had succeeded in drawing the prisoners into a rough formation about us, so that at last we formed into a rude circle, in the center of which were the doomed maids. Many had gone down on both sides, but by far the greater havoc had been wrought in the ranks of the guards of Isis. I could see messengers running swiftly through the audience, and as they passed, the nobles there unsheathed their swords and sprang into the arena. They were going to annihilate us by force of numbers. That was quite evidently their plan. I caught a glimpse of Isis leaning far forward upon her throne, her hideous countenance distorted in a horrid grimace of hate and rage, in which I thought I could distinguish an expression of fear. It was that face that inspired me to the thing that followed. Quickly I ordered 50 of the prisoners to drop back behind us and form a new circle about the maidens. "Remain and protect them until I return," I commanded. Then, turning to those who formed the outer line, I cried, "Down with Isis! Follow me to the throne. We will reap vengeance where vengeance is deserved." The youth at my side was the first to take up the cry of "Down with Isis!" And then, at my back and from all sides, rose a hoarse shout, "To the throne! To the throne!" As one man we moved, an irresistible fighting mass, over the bodies of dead and dying foes toward the gorgeous throne of the Martian deity. Hordes of the doughtiest fighting men of the firstborn poured from the audience to check our progress. We mowed them down before us as they had been paper men. "To the seats, some of you," I cried as we approached the arena's barrier wall. 10 of us can take the throne," for I had seen that Isis guards had for the most part entered the fray within the arena. On both sides of me the prisoners broke to left and right for the seats, vaulting the low wall with dripping swords, lusting for the crowded victims who awaited them. In another moment the entire amphitheater was filled with the shrieks of the dying and the wounded, mingled with the clash of arms and triumphant shouts of the victors. Side by side the young red man and I, with perhaps a dozen others, fought our way to the foot of the throne. The remaining guards, reinforced by the high dignitaries and nobles of the firstborn, closed in between us and Isis, who sat leaning far forward upon her carved sorapus bench, now screaming high-pitched commands to her following, now hurling blighting curses upon those who sought to desecrate her godhood. The frightened slaves about her trembled in wide-eyed expectancy, knowing not whether to pray for our victory or our defeat. Several among them, proud daughters no doubt of some of Barsoom's noblest warriors, snatched swords from the hands of the fallen and fell upon the guards of Isis, but they were soon cut down, glorious martyrs to a hopeless cause. The men with us fought well, but never since Tarkas and I fought out that long, hot afternoon shoulder to shoulder against the hordes of Warhoon in the Dead Sea bottom before Thark had I seen 2 men fight to such good purpose and with such unconquerable ferocity as the young red man and I fought that day before the throne of Isis, goddess of death and of life eternal. Man by man, those who stood between us and the carven sorapus wood bench went down before our blades. Others swarmed in to fill the breach, but inch by inch, foot by foot, we won nearer and nearer to our goal. Presently a cry went up from the section of the stands nearby. "Rise, slaves! Rise, slaves!" It rose and fell until it swelled to a mighty volume of sound that swept in great billows around the entire amphitheater. For an instant, as though by common assent, we ceased our fighting to look for the meaning of this new note, nor did it take but a moment to translate its significance. In all parts of the structure, the female slaves were falling upon their masters with whatever weapon came first to hand. A dagger snatched from the harness of her mistress was waved aloft by some fair slave, its shimmering blade crimson with the life-blood of its owner. swords plucked from the bodies of the dead about them, heavy ornaments which could be turned into bludgeons. Such were the implements with which these fair women wreaked the long-pent vengeance which at best could but partially recompense them for the unspeakable cruelties and indignities which their black masters had heaped upon them. And those who could find no other weapons used their strong fingers and their gleaming teeth. It was at once a sight to make one shudder and to cheer. But in a brief second we were engaged once more in our own battle, with only the unquenchable battle cry of the women to remind us that they still fought. "Rise, slaves! Rise, slaves!" Only a single thin rank of men now stood between us and Isis. Her face was blue with terror. Foam flecked her lips. She seemed too paralyzed with fear to move. Only the youth and I fought now. The others all had fallen, and I was like to have gone down too, from a nasty longsword cut, had not a hand reached out from behind my adversary and clutched his elbow as the blade was falling upon me. The youth sprang to my side and ran his sword through the fellow before he could recover to deliver another blow. I should have died even then but for that, as my sword was tight wedged in the breastbone of a dator of the firstborn. As the fellow went down, I snatched his sword from him, and over his prostrate body looked into the eyes of the one whose quick hand had saved me from the first cut of his sword. It was Fedor, daughter of Matai Shang. "Fly, my prince," she cried. "It is useless to fight them longer. All within the arena are dead. All who charged the throne are dead but you and this youth. Only among the seats are there any left of your fighting men, and they and the slave women are fast being cut down. Listen, you can scarce hear the battle cry of the women now, for nearly all are dead. For each one of you there are 10,000 blacks within the domains of the firstborn. Break for the open and the sea of chorus. With your mighty sword arm you may yet win to the golden cliffs and the templed gardens of the holy therns. There tell your story to Matai Shang, my father. He will keep you, and together you may find a way to rescue. Fly while there is yet a bare chance for flight." But that was not my mission, nor could I see much to be preferred in the cruel hospitality of the holy therns to that of the firstborn. "Down with Isis!" I shouted, and together the boy and I took up the fight once more. 2 blacks went down with our swords in their vitals, and we stood face to face with Isis. As my sword went up to end her horrid career, her paralysis left her, and with an ear-piercing shriek she turned to flee. Directly behind her, a black gulf suddenly yawned in the flooring of the dais. She sprang for the opening, with the youth and I close at her heels. Her scattered guard rallied at her cry and rushed for us. A blow fell upon the head of the youth. He staggered and would have fallen, but I caught him in my left arm and turned to face an infuriated mob of religious fanatics, crazed by the affront I had put upon their goddess, just as Isis disappeared into the black depths beneath me. End of chapter 11. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland.
Doomed to die. For an instant I stood there before they fell upon me, but the first rush of them forced me back a step or two. My foot felt for the floor, but found only empty space. I had backed into the pit which had received Isis. For a second I toppled there upon the brink. Then I, too, with the boy still tightly clutched in my arms, pitched backward into the black abyss. We struck a polished chute. The opening above us closed as magically as it had opened, and we shot down unharmed into a dimly lighted apartment far below the arena. As I rose to my feet, the first thing I saw was the malignant countenance of Isis glaring at me through the heavy bars of a grated door at one side of the chamber. "Rash mortal," she shrilled, "you shall pay the awful penalty for your blasphemy in this secret cell. Here you shall lie alone and in darkness with the carcass of your accomplice festering in its rottenness by your side,
until, crazed by loneliness and hunger, you feed upon the crawling maggots that were once a man." That was all. In another instant she was gone, and the dim light which had filled the cell faded into Cimmerian blackness. "Pleasant old lady," said a voice at my side. "Who speaks?" I asked. "'Tis I, your companion, who has the honor this day of fighting shoulder to shoulder with the greatest warrior that ever wore metal upon Barsoom." "I thank God that you are not dead," I said. "I feared for that nasty cut upon your head." "It but stunned me," he replied. "A mere scratch." "Maybe it were as well had it been final," I said. "We seem to be in a pretty fix here, with a splendid chance of dying of starvation and thirst." "Where are we?" "Beneath the arena," I replied. "We tumbled down the shaft that swallowed Isis, as she was almost at our mercy." He laughed a low laugh of pleasure and relief, and then, reaching out through the inky blackness, he sought my shoulder and pulled my ear close to his mouth. "Nothing could be better," he whispered. "There are secrets within the secrets of Isis, of which Isis herself does not dream." "What do you mean?" "I labored with the other slaves a year in the remodeling of these subterranean galleries, and at that time we found below these an ancient system of corridors and chambers that had been sealed up for ages. The blacks in charge of the work explored them, taking several of us along to do whatever work there might be occasion for. I know the entire system perfectly. There are miles of corridors honeycombing the ground beneath the gardens and the temple itself, and there is one passage that leads down to and connects with the lower regions that open on the water shaft that gives passage to Omeen. If we can reach the submarine undetected, we may yet make the sea, in which there are many islands where the blacks never go. There we may live for a time, and who knows what may transpire to aid us to escape." He had spoken all in a low whisper, evidently fearing spying ears even here, and so I answered him in the same subdued tone. "Lead back to Shador, my friend," I whispered. "Zodar the Black is there. We were to attempt our escape together, so I cannot desert him." "No," said the boy, "one cannot desert a friend. It were better to be recaptured ourselves than that." Then he commenced groping his way about the floor of the dark chamber, searching for the trap that led to the corridors beneath. At length he summoned me by a low "Sst!" and I crept toward the sound of his voice, to find him kneeling on the brink of an opening in the floor. "There is a drop here of about 10 feet," he whispered. "Hang by your hands, and you will alight safely on a level floor of soft sand." Very quietly I lowered myself from the inky cell above into the inky pit below. So utterly dark was it that we could not see our hands at an inch from our noses. Never, I think, have I known such complete absence of light as existed in the pits of Isis. For an instant I hung in mid-air. There is a strange sensation connected with an experience of that nature, which is quite difficult to describe. When the feet tread empty air, and the distance below is shrouded in darkness, there is a feeling akin to panic at the thought of releasing the hold and taking the plunge into unknown depths. Although the boy had told me that it was but 10 feet to the floor below, I experienced the same thrills as though I were hanging above a bottomless pit. Then I released my hold and dropped 4 feet to a soft cushion of sand. The boy followed me. "Raise me to your shoulders," he said, "and I will replace the trap." This done, he took me by the hand, leading me very slowly, with much feeling about and frequent halts to assure himself that he did not stray into wrong passageways. Presently we commenced the descent of a very steep incline. "It will not be long," he said, "before we shall have light. At the lower levels we meet the same stratum of phosphorescent rock that illuminates Omeen." Never shall I forget that trip through the pits of Isis. While it was devoid of important incidents, yet it was filled for me with a strange charm of excitement and adventure, which I think must have hinged principally on the unguessable antiquity of these long-forgotten corridors.
The things which the Stygian darkness hid from my objective eye could not have been half so wonderful as the pictures which my imagination wrought, as it conjured to life again the ancient peoples of this dying world, and set them once more to the labors, the intrigues, the mysteries, and the cruelties which they had practiced to make their last stand against the swarming hordes of the dead sea bottoms that had driven them, step by step, to the uttermost pinnacle of the world, where they were now entrenched behind an impenetrable barrier of superstition. In addition to the green men, there had been 3 principal races upon Barsoom: the blacks, the whites, and a race of yellow men. As the waters of the planet dried and the seas receded, all other resources dwindled until life upon the planet became a constant battle for survival. The various races had made war upon one another for ages, and the 3 higher types had easily bested the green savages of the water places of the world. But now that the receding seas necessitated constant abandonment of their fortified cities, and forced upon them a more or less nomadic life, in which they became separated into smaller communities, they soon fell prey to the fierce hordes of green men. The result was a partial amalgamation of the blacks, whites, and yellows, the result of which is shown in the present splendid race of red men. I had always supposed that all traces of the original races had disappeared from the face of Mars. Yet within the past 4 days I had found both whites and blacks in great multitudes. Could it be possible that in some far-off corner of the planet there still existed a remnant of the ancient race of yellow men? My reveries were broken in upon by a low exclamation from the boy. "At last, the lighted way!" he cried. And looking up, I beheld at a long distance before us a dim radiance. As we advanced, the light increased, until presently we emerged into well-lighted passageways. From then on our progress was rapid, until we came suddenly to the end of a corridor that led directly upon the ledge surrounding the pool of the submarine. The craft lay at her moorings with uncovered hatch. Raising his finger to his lips, and then tapping his sword in a significant manner, the youth crept noiselessly toward the vessel. I was close at his heels. Silently we dropped to the deserted deck, and on hands and knees crawled toward the hatchway. A stealthy glance below revealed no guard in sight, and so, with the quickness and the soundlessness of cats, we dropped together into the main cabin of the submarine. Even here was no sign of life. Quickly we covered and secured the hatch. Then the boy stepped into the pilot-house, touched a button, and the boat sank amid swirling waters toward the bottom of the shaft. Even then there was no scurrying of feet, as we had expected, and while the boy remained to direct the boat, I slid from cabin to cabin in futile search for some member of the crew. The craft was entirely deserted. Such good fortune seemed almost unbelievable. When I returned to the pilot-house to report the good news to my companion, he handed me a paper. "This may explain the absence of the crew," he said. It was a radio aerial message to the commander of the submarine. "The slaves have risen. Come with what men you have, and those that you can gather on the way. Too late to get aid from Omeen. They are massacring all within the amphitheater. Isis is threatened. Haste. Zethod." "Zethod is daughter of the guards of Isis," explained the youth. "We gave them a bad scare, one that they will not soon forget." "Let us hope that it is but the beginning of the end of Isis," I said. "Only our first ancestor knows," he replied. We reached the submarine pool of Omeen without incident. Here we debated the wisdom of sinking the craft before leaving her, but finally decided that it would add nothing to our chances for escape. There were plenty of blacks in Omeen to thwart us were we apprehended. However many more might come from the temples and gardens of Isis would not in any way decrease our chances. We were now in a quandary as to how to pass the guards who patrolled the island about the pool. At last I hit upon a plan. "What is the name or title of the officer in charge of these guards?" I asked the boy. "A fellow named Toreth was on duty when we entered this morning," he replied. "Good. And what is the name of the commander of the submarine? Yersted. I found a dispatch blank in the cabin and wrote the following order: Dator Toreth. Return these 2 slaves at once to Shador. Yersted.
That will be the simpler way to return, I said, smiling, as I handed the forged letter to the boy. Come, we shall see now how well it works.
But our swords, he exclaimed. What shall we say to explain them? Since we cannot explain them, we shall have to leave them behind us, I replied. Is it not the extreme of rashness to thus put ourselves again unarmed in the power of the firstborn? It is the only way, I answered. You may trust me to find a way out of the prison of Shador, and I think, once out, that we shall find no great difficulty in arming ourselves once more in a country which abounds so plentifully in armed men. As you say, he replied with a smile and shrug. I could not follow another leader who inspired greater confidence than you. Come, let us put your ruse to the test. Boldly we emerged from the hatchway of the craft, leaving our swords behind us, and strode to the main exit, which led to the sentry's post and the office of the Dator of the guard. At sight of us, the members of the guard sprang forward in surprise, and with leveled rifles halted us. I held out the message to one of them. He took it, and seeing to whom it was addressed, turned and handed it to Toreth, who was emerging from his office to learn the cause of the commotion. The black read the order, and for a moment eyed us with evident suspicion. "Where is Dator Yersted?" he asked, and my heart sank within me as I cursed myself for a stupid fool in not having sunk the submarine to make good the lie that I must tell. His orders were to return immediately to the temple landing, I replied. Toreth took a half step toward the entrance to the pool, as though to corroborate my story. For that instant everything hung in the balance, for had he done so and found the empty submarine still lying at her wharf, the whole weak fabric of my concoction would have tumbled about our heads. But evidently he decided the message must be genuine, nor indeed was there any good reason to doubt it, since it would scarce have seemed credible to him that 2 slaves would voluntarily have given themselves into custody in any such manner as this. It was the very boldness of the plan which rendered it successful. "Were you connected with the rising of the slaves?" asked Toreth. "We have just had meager reports of some such event." "All were involved," I replied, "but it amounted to little. The guards quickly overcame and killed the majority of us." He seemed satisfied with this reply. "Take them to Shador," he ordered, turning to one of his subordinates. We entered a small boat lying beside the island, and in a few minutes were disembarking upon Shador. Here we were returned to our respective cells, I with Zodar, the boy by himself, and behind locked doors we were again prisoners of the firstborn.
End of chapter 12. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Gods of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland.
A break for liberty. Zodar listened in incredulous astonishment to my narration of the events which had transpired within the arena at the rites of Isis. He could scarcely conceive, even though he had already professed his doubt as to the deity of Isis, that one could threaten her with sword in hand and not be blasted into 1,000 fragments by the mere fury of her divine wrath. "It is the final proof," he said at last. "No more is needed to completely shatter the last remnant of my superstitious belief in the divinity of Isis. She is only a wicked old woman, wielding a mighty power for evil through machinations that have kept her own people and all Barsoom in religious ignorance for ages." "She is still all-powerful here, however," I replied, "so it behooves us to leave at the first moment that appears at all propitious." "I hope that you may find a propitious moment," he said, with a laugh, "for it is certain that in all my life I have never seen one in which a prisoner of the firstborn might escape." "Tonight will do as well as any," I replied. "It will soon be night," said Zodar. "How may I aid in this adventure?" "Can you swim?" I asked him. No slimy Scythian that haunts the depths of Chorus is more at home in water than is Zodar, he replied. Good. The Red One, in all probability, cannot swim, I said, since there is scarce enough water in all their domains to float the tiniest craft. One of us, therefore, will have to support him through the sea to the craft we select. I had hoped that we might make the entire distance below the surface, but I fear that the Red Youth could not thus perform the trip. Even the bravest of the brave among them are terrorized at the mere thought of deep water, for it has been ages since their forebears saw a lake, a river, or a sea. The Red One is to accompany us? Asked Zodar. Yes. It is well. 3 swords are better than 2, especially when the third is as mighty as this fellow's. I have seen him battle in the arena at the rites of Isis many times. Never until I saw you fight had I seen one who seemed unconquerable, even in the face of great odds. One might think you two master and pupil, or father and son. Come to recall his face, there is a resemblance between you. It is very marked when you fight. There is the same grim smile, the same maddening contempt for your adversary apparent in every movement of your bodies, and in every changing expression of your faces. Be that as it may, Zodar, he is a great fighter. I think that we will make a trio difficult to overcome, and if my friend Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, were but one of us, we could fight our way from one end of Barsoom to the other, though the whole world were pitted against us. It will be, said Zodar, when they find from whence you have come. That is but one of the superstitions which Isis has foisted upon a credulous humanity. She works through the holy Therns, who are as ignorant of her real self as are the Barsoomians of the outer world. Her decrees are borne to the Therns written in blood upon a strange parchment. The poor deluded fools think that they are receiving the revelations of a goddess through some supernatural agency, since they find these messages upon their guarded altars, to which none could have access without detection. I myself have borne these messages for Isis for many years. There is a long tunnel from the temple of Isis to the principal temple of Matai Sham. It was dug ages ago by the slaves of the firstborn in such utter secrecy that no Thern ever guessed its existence. The Therns, for their part, have temples dotted about the entire civilized world. Here, priests whom the people never see communicate the doctrine of the mysterious River Iss, the Valley of Dor, and the lost Sea of Chorus, to persuade the poor deluded creatures to take the voluntary pilgrimage that swells the wealth of the holy Therns and adds to the numbers of their slaves. Thus, the Therns are used as the principal means for collecting the wealth and labor that the firstborn wrest from them as they need it. Occasionally, the firstborn themselves make raids upon the outer world. It is then that they capture many females of the royal houses of the Red Men, and take the newest in battleships and the trained artisans who build them, that they may copy what they cannot create. We are a non-productive race, priding ourselves upon our non-productiveness. It is criminal for a firstborn to labor or invent. That is the work of the lower orders, who live merely that the firstborn may enjoy long lives of luxury and idleness. With us, fighting is all that counts. Were it not for that, there would be more of the firstborn than all the creatures of Barsoom could support, for insofar as I know, none of us ever dies a natural death. Our females would live forever but for the fact that we tire of them and remove them to make place for others. Isis alone of all is protected against death. She has lived for countless ages. Would not the other Barsoomians live forever but for the doctrine of the voluntary pilgrimage, which drags them to the bosom of ice at or before their 1000th year? I asked him. I feel now that there is no doubt but that they are precisely the same species of creature as the firstborn, and I hope that I shall live to fight for them in atonement of the sins I have committed against them, through the ignorance born of generations of false teaching. As he ceased speaking, a weird call rang out across the waters of Omeen. I had heard it at the same time the previous evening, and knew that it marked the ending of the day, when the men of Omeen spread their silks upon the deck of battleship and cruiser and fall into the dreamless sleep of Mars. Our guard entered to inspect us for the last time before the new day broke upon the world above. His duty was soon performed, and the heavy door of our prison closed behind him. We were alone for the night. I gave him time to return to his quarters, as Zodar said he probably would do. Then I sprang to the grated window and surveyed the nearby waters. At a little distance from the island, a quarter of a mile perhaps, lay a monster battleship, while between her and the shore were a number of smaller cruisers and one-man scouts. Upon the battleship alone was there a watch. I could see him plainly in the upper works of the ship, and as I watched, I saw him spread his sleeping silks upon the tiny platform in which he was stationed. Soon he threw himself at full length upon his couch. The discipline on Omeen was lax indeed, but it was not to be wondered at, since no enemy guessed the existence upon Barsoom of such a fleet, or even of the firstborn, or the Sea of Omeen. Why indeed should they maintain a watch? Presently I dropped to the floor again and talked with Zodar, describing the various craft I had seen. "There is one there," he said, "my personal property, built to carry 5 men, that is the swiftest of the swift. If we can board her, we can at least make a memorable run for liberty." And then he went on to describe to me the equipment of the boat, her engines, and all that went to make her the flyer that she was. In his explanation I recognized a trick of gearing that Kantos Khan had taught me that time we sailed under false names in the navy of Zodanga, beneath Sabthan the prince, and I knew then that the firstborn had stolen it from the ships of Helium, for only they are thus geared. And I knew, too, that Zodar spoke the truth when he lauded the speed of his little craft, for nothing that cleaves the thin air of Mars can approximate the speed of the ships of Helium. We decided to wait for an hour at least, until all the stragglers had sought their silks. In the meantime, I was to fetch the Red Youth to our cell, so that we would be in readiness to make our rash break for freedom together. I sprang to the top of our partition wall, and pulled myself up onto it. There I found a flat surface about a foot in width, and along this I walked until I came to the cell, in which I saw the boy sitting upon his bench. He had been leaning back against the wall, looking up at the glowing dome above Omeen, and when he spied me balancing upon the partition wall above him, his eyes opened wide in astonishment. Then a wide grin of appreciative understanding spread across his countenance. As I stooped to drop to the floor beside him, he motioned me to wait, and coming close below me, whispered, "Catch my hand. I can almost leap to the top of that wall myself. I have tried it many times, and each day I come a little closer. Some day I should have been able to make it." I lay upon my belly across the wall, and reached my hand far down toward him. With a little run from the center of the cell, he sprang up until I grasped his outstretched hand, and thus I pulled him to the wall's top beside me. "You are the first jumper I ever saw among the red men of Barsoom," I said. He smiled. "It is not strange. I will tell you why when we have more time." Together we returned to the cell in which Zodar sat, descending to talk with him until the hour had passed. There we made our plans for the immediate future, binding ourselves by a solemn oath to fight to the death for one another against whatsoever enemies should confront us, for we knew that even should we succeed in escaping the firstborn, we might still have a whole world against us. The power of religious superstition is mighty. It was agreed that I should navigate the craft after we reached her, and that if we made the outer world in safety, we should attempt to reach Helium without a stop. "Why Helium?" asked the Red Youth. "I am a prince of Helium," I replied. He gave me a peculiar look, but said nothing further on the subject. I wondered at the time what the significance of his expression might be, but in the press of other matters it soon left my mind, nor did I have occasion to think of it again until later. "Come," I said at length, "now is as good a time as any. Let us go." Another moment found me at the top of the partition wall again, with the boy beside me. Unbuckling my harness, I snapped it together with a single long strap, which I lowered to the waiting Zodar below. He grasped the end, and was soon sitting beside us. How simple!" he laughed. "The balance should be even simpler," I replied. Then I raised myself to the top of the outer wall of the prison, just so that I could peer over and locate the passing sentry. For a matter of 5 minutes I waited, and then he came in sight on his slow and snail-like beat about the structure. I watched him until he had made the turn at the end of the building, which carried him out of sight of the side of the prison that was to witness our dash for freedom. The moment his form disappeared, I grasped Zodar and drew him to the top of the wall. Placing one end of my harness strap in his hands, I lowered him quickly to the ground below. Then the boy grasped the strap and slid down to Zodar's side. In accordance with our arrangement, they did not wait for me, but walked slowly toward the water, a matter of 100 yards, directly past the guardhouse filled with sleeping soldiers. They had taken scarce a dozen steps when I too dropped to the ground and followed them leisurely toward the shore. As I passed the guardhouse, the thought of all the good blades lying there gave me pause, for if ever men were to have need of swords, it was my companions and I, on the perilous trip upon which we were about to embark. I glanced toward Zodar and the youth, and saw that they had slipped over the edge of the dock into the water. In accordance with our plan, they were to remain there, clinging to the metal rings which studded the concrete-like substance of the dock at the water's level, with only their mouths and noses above the surface of the sea, until I should join them. The lure of the swords within the guardhouse was strong upon me, and I hesitated a moment, half inclined to risk the attempt to take the few we needed. That he who hesitates is lost proved itself a true aphorism in this instance, for another moment saw me creeping stealthily toward the door of the guardhouse. Gently I pressed it open a crack, enough to discover a dozen blacks stretched upon their silks in profound slumber. At the far side of the room, a rack held the swords and firearms of the men. Warily I pushed the door a trifle wider to admit my body. A hinge gave out a resentful groan. One of the men stirred, and my heart stood still. I cursed myself for a fool to have thus jeopardized our chances for escape. But there was nothing for it now but to see the adventure through. With a spring as swift and as noiseless as a tiger's, I lit beside the guardsman who had moved. My hands hovered about his throat, awaiting the moment that his eyes should open. For what seemed an eternity to my overwrought nerves, I remained poised thus. Then the fellow turned again upon his side, and resumed the even respiration of deep slumber. Carefully I picked my way between and over the soldiers, until I had gained the rack at the far side of the room. Here I turned to survey the sleeping men. All were quiet. Their regular breathing rose and fell in a soothing rhythm that seemed to me the sweetest music I had ever heard. Gingerly I drew a long sword from the rack. The scraping of the scabbard against its holder as I withdrew it sounded like the filing of cast iron with a great rasp, and I looked to see the room immediately filled with alarmed and attacking guardsmen, but none stirred. The second sword I withdrew noiselessly, but the third clanked in its scabbard with a frightful din. I knew that it must awaken some of the men at least, and was on the point of forestalling their attack by a rapid charge for the doorway, when again, to my intense surprise, not a black moved. Either they were wondrous heavy sleepers, or else the noises that I made were really much less than they seemed to me. I was about to leave the rack when my attention was attracted by the revolvers. I knew that I could not carry more than one away with me, for I was already too heavily laden to move quietly with any degree of safety or speed. As I took one of them from its pin, my eye fell for the first time on an open window beside the rack. Ah, here was a splendid means of escape, for it let directly upon the dock, not 20 feet from the water's edge. And as I congratulated myself, I heard the door opposite me open, and there, looking me full in the face, stood the officer of the guard. He evidently took in the situation at a glance, and appreciated the gravity of it as quickly as I, for our revolvers came up simultaneously, and the sounds of the two reports were as one, as we touched the buttons on the grips that exploded the cartridges. I felt the wind of his bullet as it whizzed past my ear, and at the same instant I saw him crumple to the ground. Where I hit him, I do not know, nor if I killed him, for scarce had he started to collapse when I was through the window at my rear. In another second the waters of Omine closed above my head, and the three of us were making for the little flyer 100 yards away. Zodar was burdened with the boy, and I with the 3 longswords. The revolver I had dropped, so that, while we were both strong swimmers, it seemed to me that we moved at a snail's pace through the water. I was swimming entirely beneath the surface, but Zodar was compelled to rise often to let the youth breathe, so it was a wonder that we were not discovered long before we were. In fact, we reached the boat's side, and were all aboard before the watch upon the battleship, aroused by the shots, detected us. Then an alarm gun bellowed from the ship's bow, its deep boom reverberating in deafening tones beneath the rocky dome of Omine. Instantly the sleeping thousands were awake. The decks of 1,000 monster craft teemed with fighting men, for an alarm on Omine was a thing of rare occurrence. We cast away before the sound of the first gun had died, and another second saw us rising swiftly from the surface of the sea. I lay at full length along the deck with the levers and buttons of control before me. Zodar and the boy were stretched directly behind me, prone also, that we might offer as little resistance to the air as possible. "Rise high," whispered Zodar. "They dare not fire their heavy guns toward the dome. The fragments of the shells would drop back among their own craft. If we are high enough, our keel plates will protect us from rifle fire." I did as he bade. Below us we could see the men leaping into the water by hundreds, and striking out for the small cruisers and one-man flyers that lay moored about the big ships. The larger craft were getting under way, following us rapidly, but not rising from the water. "A little to your right," cried Zodar, for there are no points of compass upon Omine, where every direction is due north. The pandemonium that had broken out below us was deafening. Rifles cracked, officers shouted orders, men yelled directions to one another from the water and from the decks of myriad boats, while through all ran the purr of countless propellers cutting water and air. I had not dared pull my speed lever to the highest, for fear of overrunning the mouth of the shaft that passed from Omine's dome to the world above, but even so, we were hitting a clip that I doubt has ever been equaled on the windless sea. The smaller flyers were commencing to rise toward us, when Zodar shouted, "The shaft! The shaft! Dead ahead!" And I saw the opening, black and yawning, in the glowing dome of this underworld. A 10-man cruiser was rising directly in front to cut off our escape. It was the only vessel that stood in our way, but at the rate that it was traveling, it would come between us and the shaft in plenty of time to thwart our plans. It was rising at an angle of about 45 degrees dead ahead of us, with the evident intention of combing us with grappling hooks from above as it skimmed low over our deck. There was but one forlorn hope for us, and I took it. It was useless to try to pass over her, for that would have allowed her to force us against the rocky dome above, and we were already too near that as it was. To have attempted to dive below her would have put us entirely at her mercy, and precisely where she wanted us. On either side, 100 other menacing craft were hastening toward us. The alternative was filled with risk. In fact, it was all risk, with but a slender chance of success. As we neared the cruiser, I rose as though to pass above her, so that she would do just what she did do, rise at a steeper angle to force me still higher. Then, as we were almost upon her, I yelled to my companions to hold tight, and throwing the little vessel into her highest speed, I deflected her bows at the same instant until we were running horizontally and at terrific velocity straight for the cruiser's keel. Her commander may have seen my intentions then, but it was too late. Almost at the instant of impact, I turned my bows upward, and then, with a shattering jolt, we were in collision. What I had hoped for happened. The cruiser, already tilted at a perilous angle, was carried completely over backward by the impact of my smaller vessel. Her crew fell twisting and screaming through the air to the water far below, while the cruiser, her propellers still madly churning, dived swiftly, head foremost after them to the bottom of the Sea of Omeen. The collision crushed our steel bows, and notwithstanding every effort on our part, came near to hurling us from the deck. As it was, we landed in a wildly clutching heap at the very extremity of the flyer, where Zodar and I succeeded in grasping the handrail, but the boy would have plunged overboard had I not fortunately grasped his ankle, as he was already partially over. Unguided, our vessel careened wildly in its mad flight, rising ever nearer the rocks above. It took but an instant, however, for me to regain the levers, and, with the roof barely 50 feet above, I turned her nose once more into the horizontal plane, and headed her again for the black mouth of the shaft. The collision had retarded our progress, and now 100 swift scouts were close upon us. Zodar had told me that ascending the shaft by virtue of our repulsive rays alone would give our enemies their best chance to overtake us, since our propellers would be idle, and in rising we would be outclassed by many of our pursuers. The swifter craft are seldom equipped with large buoyancy tanks, since the added bulk of them tends to reduce the vessel's speed. As many boats were now quite close to us, it was inevitable that we should be quickly overhauled in the shaft, and captured or killed in short order. To me, there always seems a way to gain the opposite side of an obstacle. If one cannot pass over it, or below it, or around it, why then there is but a single alternative left, and that is to pass through it. I could not get around the fact that many of these other boats could rise faster than ours by the fact of their greater buoyancy. But I was none the less determined to reach the outer world far in advance of them, or die a death of my own choosing in event of failure. "Reverse!" screamed Zodar behind me. "For the love of your first ancestor, reverse! We are at the shaft." "Hold tight," I screamed in reply. "Grasp the boy and hold tight. We are going straight up the shaft." The words were scarce out of my mouth as we swept beneath the pitch-black opening. I threw the bow hard up, dragged the speed lever to its last notch, and, clutching a stanchion with one hand and the steering wheel with the other, hung on like grim death and consigned my soul to its author. I heard a little exclamation of surprise from Zodar, followed by a grim laugh. The boy laughed too, and said something which I could not catch for the whistling of the wind of our awful speed. I looked above my head, hoping to catch the gleam of stars, by which I could direct our course and hold the hurtling thing that bore us true to the center of the shaft. To have touched the side at the speed we were making would doubtless have resulted in instant death for us all. But not a star showed above, only utter and impenetrable darkness. Then I glanced below me, and there I saw a rapidly diminishing circle of light, the mouth of the opening above the phosphorescent radiance of Omeen. By this I steered, endeavoring to keep the circle of light below me ever perfect. At best, it was but a slender cord that held us from destruction, and I think that I steered that night more by intuition and blind faith than by skill or reason. We were not long in the shaft, and possibly the very fact of our enormous speed saved us, for evidently we started in the right direction, and so quickly were we out again that we had no time to alter our course. Omeen lies perhaps 2 miles below the surface crust of Mars. Our speed must have approximated 200 miles an hour, for Martian flyers are swift, so that at most we were in the shaft not over 40 seconds. We must have been out of it for some seconds before I realized that we had accomplished the impossible. Black darkness enshrouded all about us. There were neither moons nor stars. Never before had I seen such a thing upon Mars, and for the moment I was nonplussed. Then the explanation came to me. It was summer at the South Pole. The ice cap was melting, and those meteoric phenomena, clouds, unknown upon the greater part of Barsoom, were shutting out the light of heaven from this portion of the planet. Fortunate indeed it was for us, nor did it take me long to grasp the opportunity for escape which this happy condition offered us. Keeping the boat's nose at a stiff angle, I raced her for the impenetrable curtain which nature had hung above this dying world, to shut us out from the sight of our pursuing enemies. We plunged through the cold, damp fog without diminishing our speed, and in a moment emerged into the glorious light of the 2 moons and the 1,000,000 stars. I dropped into a horizontal course and headed due north. Our enemies were a good half-hour behind us, with no conception of our direction. We had performed the miraculous and come through 1,000 dangers unscathed. We had escaped from the land of the firstborn. No other prisoners in all the ages of Barsoom had done this thing, and now, as I looked back upon it, it did not seem to have been so difficult after all. I said as much to Zodar over my shoulder. "It is very wonderful, nevertheless," he replied. "No one else could have accomplished it but John Carter." At the sound of that name, the boy jumped to his feet. "John Carter?" he cried. "John Carter? Why, man, John Carter, Prince of Helium, has been dead for years. I am his son." End of chapter 13. Recording by Thomas Copeland. 14 of the Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Eyes in the Dark. My son! I could not believe my ears. Slowly I rose and faced the handsome youth. Now that I looked at him closely, I commenced to see why his face and personality had attracted me so strongly. There was much of his mother's incomparable beauty in his clear-cut features, but it was strongly masculine beauty, and his gray eyes and the expression of them were mine. The boy stood facing me, half hope and half uncertainty in his look. "Tell me of your mother," I said. "Tell me all you can of the years that I have been robbed by a relentless fate of her dear companionship." With a cry of pleasure, he sprang toward me and threw his arms about my neck, and for a brief moment, as I held my boy close to me, the tears welled to my eyes, and I was like to have choked after the manner of some maudlin fool. But I do not regret it, nor am I ashamed. A long life has taught me that a man may seem weak where women and children are concerned, and yet be anything but a weakling in the sterner avenues of life. "Your stature, your manner, the terrible ferocity of your swordsmanship," said the boy, "are as my mother has described them to me 1,000 times. But even with such evidence, I could scarce credit the truth of what seemed so improbable to me, however much I desired it to be true. Do you know what thing it was that convinced me more than all the others?" "What, my boy?" I asked. "Your first words to me. They were of my mother. None else but the man who loved her as she has told me my father did would have thought first of her. For long years, my son, I can scarce recall a moment that the radiant vision of your mother's face has not been ever before me. Tell me of her." Those who have known her longest say that she has not changed, unless it be to grow more beautiful, were that possible. Only when she thinks I am not about to see her, her face grows very sad, and oh, so wistful. She thinks ever of you, my father, and all Helium mourns with her and for her. Her grandfather's people love her. They loved you also, and fairly worship your memory as the savior of Barsoom. Each year that brings its anniversary of the day that saw you racing across a near-dead world to unlock the secret of that awful portal, behind which lay the mighty power of life for countless millions, a great festival is held in your honor. But there are tears mingled with the thanksgiving, tears of real regret that the author of the happiness is not with them to share the joy of living he died to give them. Upon all Barsoom there is no greater name than John Carter." "And by what name has your mother called you, my boy?" I asked. "The people of Helium asked that I be named with my father's name, but my mother said no, that you and she had chosen a name for me together, and that your wish must be honored before all others. So the name that she called me is the one that you desired, a combination of hers and yours, Carthoris. Zodar had been at the wheel as I talked with my son, and now he called me. "She is dropping badly by the head, John Carter," he said. "So long as we were rising at a stiff angle, it was not noticeable, but now that I am trying to keep a horizontal course, it is different. The wound in her bow has opened one of her forward ray tanks." It was true, and after I had examined the damage, I found it a much graver matter than I had anticipated. Not only was the forced angle, at which we were compelled to maintain the bow in order to keep a horizontal course, greatly impeding our speed, but at the rate that we were losing our repulsive rays from the forward tanks, it was but a question of an hour or more when we would be floating stern up and helpless. We had slightly reduced our speed with the dawning of a sense of security, but now I took the helm once more and pulled the noble little engine wide open, so that again we raced north at terrific velocity. In the meantime, Carthoris and Zodar, with tools in hand, were puttering with the great rent in the bow, in a hopeless endeavor to stem the tide of escaping rays. It was still dark when we passed the northern boundary of the ice cap and the area of clouds. Below us lay a typical Martian landscape, rolling ochre sea bottom of long dead seas, low surrounding hills, with here and there the grim and silent cities of the dead past, great piles of mighty architecture, tenanted only by age-old memories of a once powerful race, and by the great white apes of Barsoom. It was becoming more and more difficult to maintain our little vessel in a horizontal position. Lower and lower sagged the bow, until it became necessary to stop the engine, to prevent our flight terminating in a swift dive to the ground. As the sun rose, and the light of a new day swept away the darkness of our night, our craft gave a final spasmodic plunge, turned half upon her side, and then, with deck tilting at a sickening angle, swung in a slow circle, her bow dropping further below her stern each moment. To handrail and stanchion we clung, and finally, as we saw the end approaching, snapped the buckles of our harness to the rings at her sides. In another moment the deck reared at an angle of 90 degrees, and we hung in our leather, with feet dangling 1,000 yards above the ground. I was swinging quite close to the controlling devices, so I reached out to the lever that directed the rays of repulsion. The boat responded to the touch, and very gently we began to sink toward the ground. It was fully half an hour before we touched. Directly north of us rose a rather lofty range of hills, toward which we decided to make our way, since they afforded greater opportunity for concealment from the pursuers we were confident might stumble in this direction. An hour later found us in the time-rounded gullies of the hills, amid the beautiful flowering plants that abound in the arid waste places of Barsoom. There we found numbers of huge milk-giving shrubs, that strange plant which serves in great part as food and drink for the wild hordes of green men. It was indeed a boon to us, for we were nearly famished. Beneath a cluster of these, which afforded perfect concealment from wandering air scouts, we lay down to sleep. For me, the first time in many hours. This was the beginning of my 5th day upon Barsoom, since I had found myself suddenly translated from my cottage on the Hudson to Dor, the Valley Beautiful, the Valley Hideous. In all this time I had slept but twice, though once the clock around within the storehouse of the Therns. It was mid-afternoon when I was awakened by someone seizing my hand and covering it with kisses. With a start, I opened my eyes to look into the beautiful face of Thuvia. My prince, she cried, in an ecstasy of happiness. 'Tis you whom I had mourned as dead. My ancestors have been good to me. I have not lived in vain. The girl's voice awoke Zodar and Carthoris. The boy gazed upon the woman in surprise, but she did not seem to realize the presence of another than I. She would have thrown her arms around my neck and smothered me with caresses, had I not gently but firmly disengaged myself. Come, Thuvia, I said soothingly. You are overwrought by the danger and hardships you have passed through. You forget yourself, as you forget that I am the husband of the Princess of Helium." "I forget nothing, my prince," she replied. "You have spoken no word of love to me, nor do I expect you ever shall. But nothing can prevent me loving you. I would not take the place of Dejathoras. My greatest ambition is to serve you, my prince, forever as your slave. No greater boon could I ask, no greater honor could I crave, no greater happiness could I hope. As I have said before, I am no lady's man, and I must admit that I seldom have felt so uncomfortable and embarrassed as I did at that moment. While I was quite familiar with the Martian custom which allows female slaves to Martian men, whose high and chivalrous honor is always ample protection for every woman in his household, yet I had never myself chosen other than men as my body servant. "And I ever return to Helium, Thuvia," I said, "you shall go with me, but as an honored equal, and not as a slave. There you shall find plenty of handsome young nobles who would face Isis herself to win a smile from you. And we shall have you married in short order to one of the best of them. Forget your foolish gratitude begotten infatuation, which your innocence has mistaken for love. I like your friendship better, Thuvia." "You are my master. It shall be as you say," she replied simply, but there was a note of sadness in her voice. "How came you here, Thuvia?" I asked, "and where is Tarkas?" "The great Thark, I fear, is dead," she replied sadly. "He was a mighty fighter, but a multitude of green warriors of another horde than his overwhelmed him. The last that I saw of him, they were bearing him wounded and bleeding to the deserted city from which they had sallied to attack us." "You are not sure that he is dead, then?" I asked. "And where is this city of which you speak?" "It is just beyond this range of hills. The vessel in which you so nobly resigned a place that we might find escape defied our small skill in navigation, with the result that we drifted aimlessly about for 2 days. Then we decided to abandon the craft and attempt to make our way on foot to the nearest waterway. Yesterday we crossed these hills and came upon the dead city beyond. We had passed within its streets and were walking toward the central portion, when at an intersecting avenue we saw a body of green warriors approaching. Tarkas was in advance, and they saw him, but me they did not see. The Thark sprang back to my side and forced me into an adjacent doorway, where he told me to remain in hiding until I could escape, making my way to Helium if possible. "There will be no escape from me now," he said, "for these be the Warhoon of the south. When they have seen my mettle, it will be to the death." Then he stepped out to meet them. Ah, my prince, such fighting! For an hour they swarmed about him, until the Warhoon dead formed a hill where he had stood. But at last they overwhelmed him, those behind pushing the foremost upon him until there remained no space to swing his great sword. Then he stumbled and went down, and they rolled over him like a huge wave. When they carried him away toward the heart of the city, he was dead, I think, for I did not see him move. "Before we go farther, we must be sure," I said. "I cannot leave Tarkas alive among the Warhoons. Tonight I shall enter the city and make sure." "And I shall go with you," spoke Carthoris. "And I," said Zodar. "Neither one of you shall go," I replied. "It is work that requires stealth and strategy, not force. One man alone may succeed where more would invite disaster. I shall go alone. If I need your help, I will return for you." They did not like it, but both were good soldiers, and it had been agreed that I should command. The sun already was low, so that I did not have long to wait before the sudden darkness of Barsoom engulfed us. With a parting word of instructions to Carthoris and Zodar, in case I should not return, I bade them all farewell, and set forth at a rapid dog trot toward the city. As I emerged from the hills, the nearer moon was winging its wild flight through the heavens, its bright beams turning to burnished silver the barbaric splendor of the ancient metropolis. The city had been built upon the gently rolling foothills that in the dim and distant past had sloped down to meet the sea. It was due to this fact that I had no difficulty in entering the streets unobserved. The green hordes that use these deserted cities seldom occupy more than a few squares about the central plaza, and as they come and go always across the dead sea bottoms that the cities face, it is usually a matter of comparative ease to enter from the hillside. Once within the streets, I kept close in the dense shadows of the walls. At intersections, I halted a moment to make sure that none was in sight before I sprang quickly to the shadows of the opposite side. Thus I made the journey to the vicinity of the plaza without detection. As I approached the purlieus of the inhabited portion of the city, I was made aware of the proximity of the warriors' quarters by the squealing and grunting of the thoats and zitidars corralled within the hollow courtyards formed by the buildings surrounding each square. These old familiar sounds that are so distinctive of green Martian life sent a thrill of pleasure surging through me. It was as one might feel on coming home after a long absence. It was amid such sounds that I had first courted the incomparable Dejathoris in the age-old marble halls of the dead city of Korad. As I stood in the shadows at the far corner of the first square, which housed members of the horde, I saw warriors emerging from several of the buildings. They all went in the same direction, toward a great building which stood in the center of the plaza. My knowledge of green Martian customs convinced me that this was either the quarters of the principal chieftain or contained the audience chamber wherein the Jedak met his Jeds and lesser chieftains. In either event, it was evident that something was afoot which might have a bearing on the recent capture of Tarkas. To reach this building, which I now felt it imperative that I do, I must needs traverse the entire length of one square and cross a broad avenue and a portion of the plaza. From the noises of the animals which came from every courtyard about me, I knew that there were many people in the surrounding buildings, probably several communities of the great horde of the Wahoons of the south. To pass undetected among all these people was in itself a difficult task, but if I was to find and rescue the great Thark, I must expect even more formidable obstacles before success could be mine. I had entered the city from the south, and now stood on the corner of the avenue through which I had passed, and the first intersecting avenue south of the plaza. The buildings upon the south side of this square did not appear to be inhabited, as I could see no lights, and so I decided to gain the inner courtyard through one of them. Nothing occurred to interrupt my progress through the deserted pile I chose, and I came into the inner court close to the rear walls of the east buildings without detection. Within the court, a great herd of thoats and zitidars moved restlessly about, cropping the moss-like ochre vegetation which overgrows practically the entire uncultivated area of Mars. What breeze there was came from the northwest, so there was little danger that the beasts would scent me. Had they, their squealing and grunting would have grown to such a volume as to attract the attention of the warriors within the buildings. Close to the east wall, beneath the overhanging balconies of the second floors, I crept in dense shadows the full length of the courtyard until I came to the buildings at the north end. These were lighted for about 3 floors up, but above the 3rd floor all was dark. To pass through the lighted rooms was of course out of the question, since they swarmed with green Martian men and women. My only path lay through the upper floors, and to gain these it was necessary to scale the face of the wall. The reaching of the balcony of the 2nd floor was a matter of easy accomplishment. An agile leap gave my hands a grasp upon the stone handrail above. In another instant I had drawn myself up on the balcony. Here, through the open windows, I saw the green folk squatting upon their sleeping silks and furs, grunting an occasional monosyllable, which in connection with their wondrous telepathic powers is ample for their conversational requirements. As I drew closer to listen to their words, a warrior entered the room from the hall beyond. "Come, Tangama," he cried. We are to take the Thark before Kadja. Bring another with you." The warrior addressed rose, and, beckoning to a fellow squatting near, the three turned and left the apartment. If I could but follow them, the chance might come to free Tarkas at once. At least I would learn the location of his prison. At my right was a door leading from the balcony into the building. It was at the end of an unlighted hall, and on the impulse of the moment I stepped within. The hall was broad and led straight through to the front of the building. On either side were the doorways of the various apartments which lined it. I had no more than entered the corridor than I saw the three warriors at the other end, those whom I had just seen leaving the apartment. Then a turn to the right took them from my sight again. Quickly I hastened along the hallway in pursuit. My gait was reckless, but I felt that fate had been kind indeed to throw such an opportunity within my grasp, and I could not afford to allow it to elude me now. At the far end of the corridor I found a spiral stairway leading to the floors above and below. The three had evidently left the floor by this avenue. That they had gone down and not up I was sure, from my knowledge of these ancient buildings and the methods of the Wahoons. I myself had once been a prisoner of the cruel hordes of northern Wahoon, and the memory of the underground dungeon in which I lay still is vivid in my memory. And so I felt certain that Tarkas lay in the dark pits beneath some nearby building, and that in that direction I should find the trail of the three warriors leading to his cell. Nor was I wrong. At the bottom of the runway, or rather at the landing on the floor below, I saw that the shaft descended into the pits beneath, and as I glanced down, the flickering light of a torch revealed the presence of the three I was trailing. Down they went toward the pits beneath the structure, and at a safe distance behind I followed the flicker of their torch. The way led through a maze of tortuous corridors, unlighted save for the wavering light they carried. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when the party turned abruptly through a doorway at their right. I hastened on as rapidly as I dared through the darkness until I reached the point at which they had left the corridor. There, through an open door, I saw them removing the chains that secured the great Thark, Tarkas, to the wall. Hustling him roughly between them, they came immediately from the chamber, so quickly, in fact, that I was near to being apprehended. But I managed to run along the corridor in the direction I had been going in my pursuit of them, far enough to be without the radius of their meager light as they emerged from the cell. I had naturally assumed that they would return with Tarkas the same way that they had come, which would have carried them away from me. But to my chagrin, they wheeled directly in my direction as they left the room. There was nothing for me but to hasten on in advance and keep out of the light of their torch. I dared not attempt to halt in the darkness of any of the many intersecting corridors, for I knew nothing of the direction they might take. Chance was as likely as not to carry me into the very corridor they might choose to enter. The sensation of moving rapidly through these dark passages was far from reassuring. I knew not at what moment I might plunge headlong into some terrible pit, or meet with some of the ghoulish creatures that inhabit these lower worlds beneath the dead cities of dying Mars. There filtered to me a faint radiance from the torch of the men behind, just enough to permit me to trace the direction of the winding passageways directly before me, and so keep me from dashing myself against the walls at the turns. Presently I came to a place where 5 corridors diverged from a common point. I had hastened along one of them for some little distance, when suddenly the faint light of the torch disappeared from behind me. I paused to listen for sounds of the party behind me, but the silence was as utter as the silence of the tomb. Quickly I realized that the warriors had taken one of the other corridors with their prisoner, and so I hastened back with a feeling of considerable relief to take up a much safer and more desirable position behind them. It was much slower work returning, however, than it had been coming, for now the darkness was as utter as the silence. It was necessary to feel every foot of the way back with my hand against the side wall, that I might not pass the spot where the 5 roads radiated. After what seemed an eternity to me, I reached the place and recognized it by groping across the entrances to the several corridors, until I had counted 5 of them. In not one, however, showed the faintest sign of light. I listened intently, but the naked feet of the green men sent back no guiding echoes, though presently I thought I detected the clank of side-arms in the far distance of the middle corridor. Up this then I hastened, searching for the light, and stopping to listen occasionally for a repetition of the sound. But soon I was forced to admit that I must have been following a blind lead, as only darkness and silence rewarded my efforts. Again I retraced my steps toward the parting of the ways, when to my surprise I came upon the entrance to 3 diverging corridors, any one of which I might have traversed in my hasty dash after the false clue I had been following. Here was a pretty fix indeed. Once back at the point where the 5 passageways met, I might wait with some assurance for the return of the warriors with Charles Tarkas. My knowledge of their customs lent color to the belief that he was being escorted to the audience chamber to have sentence passed upon him. I had not the slightest doubt but that they would preserve so doughty a warrior as the great Thark for the rare sport he would furnish at the great games. But unless I could find my way back to that point, the chances were most excellent that I would wander for days through the awful blackness until, overcome by thirst and hunger, I lay down to die. What was that? A faint shuffling sounded behind me, and as I cast a hasty glance over my shoulder, my blood froze in my veins for the thing I saw there. It was not so much fear of the present danger, as it was the horrifying memories it recalled of that time I near went mad over the corpse of the man I had killed in the dungeons of the Warhoons, when blazing eyes came out of the dark recesses and dragged the thing that had been a man from my clutches, and I heard it scraping over the stone of my prison as they bore it away to their terrible feast. And now, in these black pits of the other Warhoons, I looked into those same fiery eyes, blazing at me through the terrible darkness, revealing no sign of the beast behind. I think that the most fearsome attribute of these awesome creatures is their silence, and the fact that one never sees them, nothing but those baleful eyes glaring unblinkingly out of the dark void behind. Grasping my long sword tightly in my hand, I backed slowly along the corridor, away from the thing that watched me, but ever as I retreated, the eyes advanced, nor was there any sound, not even the sound of breathing, except the occasional shuffling sound, as of the dragging of a dead limb, that had first attracted my attention. On and on I went, but I could not escape my sinister pursuer. Suddenly I heard the shuffling noise at my right, and looking, saw another pair of eyes, evidently approaching from an intersecting corridor. As I started to renew my slow retreat, I heard the noise repeated behind me, and then, before I could turn, I heard it again at my left. The things were all about me. They had me surrounded at the intersection of 2 corridors. Retreat was cut off in all directions, unless I chose to charge one of the beasts. Even then, I had no doubt but that the others would hurl themselves upon my back. I could not even guess the size or nature of the weird creatures. That they were of goodly proportions I guessed from the fact that the eyes were on a level with my own. Why is it that darkness so magnifies our dangers? By day, I would have charged the great Banth itself, had I thought it necessary, but hemmed in by the darkness of these silent pits, I hesitated before a pair of eyes. Soon I saw that the matter shortly would be taken entirely out of my hands, for the eyes at my right were moving slowly nearer me, as were those at my left and those behind and before me. Gradually they were closing in upon me, but still that awful, stealthy silence. For what seemed hours, the eyes approached gradually closer and closer, until I felt that I should go mad for the horror of it. I had been constantly turning this way and that to prevent any sudden rush from behind, until I was fairly worn out. At length I could endure it no longer, and taking a fresh grasp upon my long sword, I turned suddenly and charged down upon one of my tormentors. As I was almost upon it, the thing retreated before me, but a sound from behind caused me to wheel in time to see 3 pairs of eyes rushing at me from the rear. With a cry of rage, I turned to meet the cowardly beasts, but as I advanced, they retreated, as had their fellow. Another glance over my shoulder discovered the first eyes sneaking on me again, and again I charged, only to see the eyes retreat before me and hear the muffled rush of the 3 at my back. Thus we continued, the eyes always a little closer in the end than they had been before, until I thought that I should go mad with the terrible strain of the ordeal. That they were waiting to spring upon my back seemed evident, and that it would not be long before they succeeded was equally apparent, for I could not endure the wear of this repeated charge and countercharge indefinitely. In fact, I could feel myself weakening from the mental and physical strain I had been undergoing. At that moment, I caught another glimpse from the corner of my eye of the single pair of eyes at my back making a sudden rush upon me. I turned to meet the charge. There was a quick rush of the 3 from the other direction, but I determined to pursue the single pair until I should have at least settled my account with one of the beasts, and thus be relieved of the strain of meeting attacks from both directions. There was no sound in the corridor, only that of my own breathing, yet I knew that those 3 uncanny creatures were almost upon me. The eyes in front were not retreating so rapidly now. I was almost within sword reach of them. I raised my sword arm to deal the blow that should free me, and then I felt a heavy body upon my back. A cold, moist, slimy something fastened itself upon my throat. I stumbled and went down.
End of chapter 14. Recording by Thomas Copeland.